I'm Jen Southern, one of the co-directors of the Centre for Mobilities Research, and I'm really pleased to welcome Ole B. Jensen from Aalborg University, who is a professor in the Department of Architecture, Design and Media Technology. He has specialisms in urban design, mobilities, green societies, and mobility and tracking technologies, and I think particularly more recently in terms of drones. He's had a really long relationship with the Centre for Mobilities Research. So I think I first met Ole back in 2014 when he was doing a research residency here, and we ran a design mobilities research day in the room just adjacent to this. And Ole is a leading figure now in mobilities research in the global mobilities research discipline. And I think really founded the idea of design mobilities as an area. He's a prolific, has prolific publications, including mobilities design, urban designs for mobile situations, designing mobilities, staging mobilities, and as a co-editor of the Handbook of Urban Mobilities, amongst hundreds of others. When I was looking at your profile earlier, I think your publications are something like 290 publications overall. So really prolific researcher. So today he will be presenting about his forthcoming book, Mobility Injustice by Design, and we are all fascinated to hear more. So it's a great pleasure to hand over to Ole.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I didn't do the housekeeping things. So Ole's going to speak for about 30 minutes. If you're online, please mute yourself or we will just mute you. We'll be taking questions at the end and we'll be monitoring those questions in the chat. If we can open up for people to speak. But we'll have to come to that when we get to that point. So thank you very much.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Jen. And hello to everybody online and in the room. I'm really happy to be here back in Seymour. So what I wanted to share with you today are some thoughts related to a coming book, Mobility Injustice by Design, and some reflections related to some work in progress. Let me see if I can run this machine correctly.
Yes.
I'm not sure how this works.
This arrow there.
Yeah.
Let me just
do a ton of things.
Let's try that. Yes.
Right. Thank you. So this is just a rough outline of the presentation. So I'm going to start off with a few remarks for introduction. I'm going to spend a little time on the framing questions and the framing related to bodies, injustice, and design. And then I'm going to dive into the empirical examples that are all reflected in the book, chapter by chapter. And then in the section on the design role in society, I'll be speaking a little bit more about some ideas that I'm trying to work around with my ongoing writings for a follow-up book, as it were, and then hopefully some concluding reflections at the end. So for starting, the abstract that I sort of announced here was sort of taking the outset in the Mobility Injustice by Design book, in which I'm trying to connect some of the research done already in mobility justice, but also trying to connect to a slightly different way of addressing things in terms of injustice and then relating that to design, but still within the area of mobilities. In the book, I'm roughly, or I'm dealing with three empirical areas: unhoused, people in homelessness, disability studies, and aging. People in aging societies, trying to see how they are each of them affected by the design decisions taken in our cities around the world. This is my sort of standard attunement for these types of lectures. So if you try to imagine walking in the city after dark, looking for a place to sleep in the street, this is the reality of millions of unhoused people and street sleepers around the world every day. Often they'll be met by benches angled so that horizontally placed bodies would fall off simply due to gravity, or metal spikes, metal spikes inserted into the surfaces under bridges where one could have had shelter. Or you might be a senior citizen struggling with walking the rumbling stone pavements of the city streets. Worse, it will only get when you're trying to cross the big streets with light crossings. The green period that is designed into the system has its priority to make cars circulate the city as seamlessly as possible, with the result that slow-walking citizens cannot cross the roads quickly enough. As you start experiencing this over time, you tend to be less interested in going out into the city, and you may stop doing so completely. Or you might be a wheelchair user struggling to move around The city, high curbs, lack of ramps, and artifacts such as cafe chairs or advertising signs on the sidewalk makes the daily urban trip a hassle rather than a joy. So if you try to imagine the position and the positionality of these citizens, we are connecting to a couple of key questions that I like to reference from the literature. Disability scholar Sarah Hendren asked the simple question, who is the world built for? I think this is a simple but also very powerful question that has been influencing my thoughts in this work, but also connecting to Michelle's work in mobility justice, where she asks, who counts as a person? So these are some of the fundamental questions that is leading to a little wider set of questions that I'm interested in this work. How do we learn to see what I call the normativity of design? How are values inscribed into the made and design spaces and artifacts and technologies? And how do we orchestrate an informed conversation about the commoning of the values of normativity of design? And how are these lessons valuable for questions of transformation towards a more just and sustainable social future? How is design excluding unhoused street sleepers, disabled or senior citizens from moving freely within the infrastructural landscapes of the contemporary city? And can mobility justice be brought about? And how can new knowledge mobilize design ethics aiming at this matter of concern? So these are the sort of background issues and framing questions that I'm interested in engaging with, both in this book, but also in the coming book that I'm writing on. So let me try to then, before talking about the sort of empiricals, talk a little bit about the theoretical framing. I'm seeing this research as part of a wider conversation, a critical research agenda, where a number of different ways in which you can engage with design is connected across, you might say, a basic position of sociology, which is where I come from. So I'm really interested in the literature connecting design and mobility justice. And some of this is already well known to most of the mobility term scholars, but I also increasingly, through my work with critical disability studies and universal design, I've been introduced to a different set of literatures, like the work of David Gisson, but also Danakov's and Dokumachi's and Ali Hamrai's work, connecting to user groups that are experiencing these sorts of exclusions on a daily basis in cities all over the world. And so that's part of what has been influential on my framing. Thinking about exclusion and design and injustice, I think there are two, or very simple, but also very powerful and important distinction to be made. One is the intended exclusion by design, which is, for instance, in this image taken in the streets of Philadelphia, where everybody can see that this is not an armrest. This is a metal device put on a horizontal surface with the purpose of making it impossible to lie down and then seek rest and shelter. So a very deliberate, intended action of exclusion, which is made by design. So design, regardless of how we have this conversation about, designers' roles and stuff like that, I think design is complicit in a very intentional sort of way in this type of thing. And the next diagram is well known by most people in urban planning, and this is a diagram over Appleyard's famous 1981 study, showing that the number of acquaintances and friends that you have across the street is a function of the volume of traffic. Now, the reason I've taken this here is because traffic planners were not intending to keep people from being friends across the street. So this is an unintended consequence of the flow system of the car-based mobility system that you find in the city. So it's still making an exclusionary practice, but it's not intended as such. And I think both cases are interesting. And in the book, I'm exploring both of them and also the gray zone around intentionality and unintended, that I think is very important to carry in our minds. The outset from where I work is urban design. So there are many different kinds of design. I'm also interested in all kinds of technologies that are mediating these sorts of things. But basically, I'm coming from an interest and a work with urban designers and an interest in design. And this is Lynch's definition. He says, design is the playful creation and strict evaluation of the possible forms of something, including how it's to be made. That something need not to be a physical object, nor is design expressed only in drawings. Although attempts have been made to reduce design to completely explicit systems of search and synthesis, it remains an art, a peculiar mix of rationality and irrationality. Design deals with qualities, with complex connections, and also with ambiguities. I think the complex connections and ambiguities are particularly what we're looking at when we're trying to understand how people in various positions are enrolled into these systems and how design affects the mobility injustices on the ground. Furthermore, I want to take that towards, in this framework, we are talking about mobilities. So together with Ditte Bendix-Lang back in 2017, I published this book on urban design for mobile situations, where we talked about mobilities research as a sort of material pragmatism. So I'm thinking about the move towards a notion of material pragmatism, which means to connect the pragmatic and situational question, how design decisions and interventions are staging mobilities, but also what are the names of our mobility experiences? What do they mean and how do they materialize? So exploring the meaning of everyday life mobility and the importance of design decisions and interventions across a wide set of professions is shaping the situational conditions for billions of people in mundane settings. So I'm interested in these very specific and concrete questions and how they are having material effects, but also how they have very specific effects to people. So it's sort of the part framework is, of course, mobilities. And then increasingly, there's an interesting conversation about justice. This is just a very quick bullet pointing of the different types of conversations and types of justice analysis. We have distributed justice, procedural, deliberative, restorative, epistemic, environmental justice, and so forth. I'm particularly interested in this work in recognition theory, and also because I'm interested in the way in which subjects, people, citizens are actually responding and feeling. And often this is not just about distribution of goods and bads, but it's also very much about recognition, very much about how you feel as a citizen. So I think this connects to a wider conversation that we have around ethics of care. This is from Balangiri and Swanen's work, where they argue that adopting this ethics of care as a framework for justice implies a decisive move away from distributive or liberal approaches to justice, seen as right versus wrong, towards situated discussions of how mobile moral subjects are constituted and of the imbricated nature of movement, bodies, gender, environment, and energy. The central question becomes how to care optimally for mobility needs of the most vulnerable and for the non-human environments in an ongoing collective and reflective process. So we're reminded by Tronto that care is both a practice and a disposition. Tronto argues that on the most general level, we suggest that caring be viewed as a species activity that includes everything that we need, that we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world, so that we can live in it as well as possible. That world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex life-sustaining web. So I think the literature on mobility justice is very important, and it sort of has a lot of significant things to say to us. But during my work, I also came to think that maybe there is a point in shifting the focus from justice to injustice. I'm not going to read out all of these quotes, but just the top one from Sklar saying that justice radiates no emotional appeal. The value of justice lies, after all, in impartiality and universality. Injustice, on the other hand, is effectively rich in a way that doing justice is not, and is not meant to be. Injustice, to put in another way, is felt and necessarily particular and partial in a way that justice is not. Injustice is passionately felt. And you can see highlighted in red senses of injustice, shame, anger, indignation, embodiment, emotion, intimacy, and affect. So what I think we get from shifting from the justice question to the injustice is also an underlining of the perspective of how does it feel? How does it feel for citizens to be subject to particular choices in design that enables or disables them from doing various things in the city in terms of mobility. So I would argue in the book that injustice is also a feeling, and we need to add to the notion of mobility injustice as a lack of resource and opportunities, that mobility injustice is a feeling, an affect, and an emotion. So I want to span out this exploration of mobility injustice in a space reaching from injustice as redistribution to injustice as experience. Or spoken in a more general note, we might think of distribution as one of injustice of excess versus injustice as effect. And of course, you can have both dimensions present at the same time, but I think it's a matter of foregrounding and backgrounding one or the other. And more importantly, addressing injustice as a feeling allows us to include sensation, affect, and atmosphere into the account of mobility and justice. In this research, I'm working on the assumption that mobility injustice is a feeling, and that the ways in which street sleepers, disabled, and senior citizens experience exclusion and marginalization as effect of planning, design, and architecture is much more than measurable distribution of opportunities or goods. Feeling rejected by the material artifacts and spatial designs is something that works on subjects at a very profound and human level. The sensorial and affectual registering of injustice by design requires that we address the relation between bodies, materiality, and experience. Scheller argues that mobility injustice begins with our bodies. She argues that, quote, the problem of mobility injustice begins with our bodies and the way in which some bodies can move more easily through space than others due to restrictions on mobility relating to gender, race, class, ethnicity, sexuality, and physical abilities. Secondly, mobility injustice concerns the shape and the build environments by uneven infrastructures and land use, including the forms of buildings and streets, vehicles, public transits, and other forms of transport infrastructure that have long been part of the making of racially segregated cities, sexually unsafe areas, and places of class exclusion. So we're reminded of the central placement of the body. Elsewhere, I talked about the openness of the body, or the osmosis, but also a thinker like Tim Ingold argues here in this quote that we are inhabitants not of our bodies, but of a world. The body, with its organs of sense, affords an opening to this world, not a means of separation. It offers exposure, not immunity. Light and sound then are neither in here or there, neither mental nor physical. On the contrary, the very experience of light or sound is one in which the interface is dissolved, in which mind and world, the sensing and the sensible, fuse together, and in doing so constitute a field of perception. So I'm interested in this field of perception and how it's mediated through design decisions in the city. So to paraphrase this old sort of saying, first we create the buildings and then they create us. I'm interested in the complex, intertwined, and circular relationship that exists between us as humans, bodies, and the material environments wherein we exist. So this means that we're enrolled and related, but not separate from the environment. And it also means that somehow, someone somewhere has decided how these habitats and environments should materialize and manifest themselves. They're a result of design decisions and design practices, and therefore it becomes central to the aim of this book and my work to understand not only what design is and what it does, but also that design may be working counter to the widespread cultural belief that design is in the service of the good, and design is liberating and emancipating. Rather, and this is one of the key insights behind the work, design may work to exclude, and design may work to tell off humans from various activities and places. So I very quickly tried to walk you through the scaffolding of frameworks, setting mobility at center, but thinking about the relationship between injustice, design, and bodies, which is central to this work. So what I'm going to do now in the remaining part is that I'm going to dive into the three sections of empirical voices and evidences. So the three examples referring to the areas of the unhoused, disability studies, and aging societies are each on their own dealt with in different ways. So for the first one, the unhoused, I'm referring particularly to the work and primary data that we made in our research project on exclusionary design. So it's based on ethnographic work done in the streets of Copenhagen mainly, together with people in homelessness, and so those would be the voices. I want to kick off though, however, with a first quote that I picked up. That I picked up just when I was starting off this research some years ago. This is a newspaper quote from Andrew, a person that has become homeless. And it says that from ubiquitous protrusions on window ledges to bus shelter seats that pivot forward, from water sprinklers and loud music to hard tubular rests, from metal park benches with solid dividers to forests of pointed cement bollards on the bridges, urban spaces are aggressively rejecting soft human bodies. We see these measures all the time within our urban environments, whether in London or Tokyo, but we fail to process their true intent. I started scanning my surroundings with the distinct purpose of finding shelter, and the city's barbed cruelty became clear. I think this was a very strong first-person account that was sort of setting me on the track to start to go a little deeper into these conversations and these ideas. And so this is a quote from one of our informants, who argues that exclusionary design is a huge obstacle, and when one is already an outcast, then you will be fully crushed. That's why we're on the street. We're outcasts, and we gather in the city among people and to feel safe, around hubs where there are people around the clock because you might meet someone you know or could help you. And we are being moved around the city to places where we least of all want to be, but we have to comply. So this idea that we are already sort of the material environment is sort of dismissing us. And to put even more strongly is this other informant arguing that these are actually some of the things people don't get when I talk to them about life on the street, precisely that it is so stressful. Then I might ask folks, have you ever tried to move 10 different locations in 8 hours? And they'll go, no, but. There is no but. You just answered no, that you never tried that. So don't give me that but. Don't pretend you know how it feels. Just listen. That is something that makes me sad. When I meet that superiority, just listen to what I say. And he's shouting here. I'm telling you, because I'm out there on the street. Try to feel my shoes. Come on, walk a bit in my shoes. I'm saying this because I've sensed it. I've been there, tested it, smelled it, and all the things the senses provide. And then you shouldn't sit there and say, no, but this is a totally different life. You just listen. So I think in all these accounts, I think injustice is felt. Injustice is an evocative, emotional thing. And even though I totally respect the research being done around distribution of fair transportation and so forth, I think this perspective is really, really important. The way it acts on people's self-perception, on their identities, on the way in which they think about themselves. The two other areas in the book, disabilities and aging populations, I've been working mostly on secondary data, on accounts giving within the literature. So just that as a disclaimer, sorry. So here's a respondent saying, it makes me feel like I don't count. It makes me feel like people are really stupid and they've overlooked or they've made decisions about something that they know nothing about. Working in local government, I'm very aware of that. I just got so exhausted and tired of talking about mobility issues constantly. I'm like a broken record and nobody would listen. I also feel that I'm a second-class citizen and I don't count. I feel, why are you making it harder for me? It's tokenistic. So this idea or this perception of feeling that you don't count is a sort of citizen denial, which is of course here not in the intended, but rather in the unintended consequence of design, but nevertheless equally important for us to deal with when we think about mobility injustice invoked by design. Another quote from a respondent saying, has it got a train station that's got a lift? Are the lift working? And so wherever you go, you've got to plan if the lift is working or not working. You've got to do this convoluted exercise to get from where to go. It's pretty chronic. There are a couple of places that I've been going regularly a few times and you get stuck. So this idea that many people with disabilities gives this account that their travel is starting way longer before anyone else's because they have to make sure that they're actually sure to be able to navigate and come in and come out of these stations and places on and the duration of the trip is 3, 4, 5 times longer than for anyone who does not have these sorts of issues. Here's another quote from a blind person saying, I think that the most universal problem for our safety is the circulation, traffic lights. We fought for a lot of years that we would continue to fight more and more audible traffic lights. But the problem is that cities consider that it's really expensive and they're not really interested in installing a lot of them. So it's really the most difficult aspect, the most unsafe aspects of traveling in urban areas. So this idea again of having this sense of, how can we be counted for as a citizen group and as a group, and constantly being met with this sort of cost conversation and whether it's actually a burden for society. The final group I want just very quickly to touch upon is then aging groups in society, which is of course a big issue in many societies and cities around the world. Here's a quote from a male respondent saying, I find it very frustrating, my lack of mobility. I live 100 yards at most from this hall, and it will take me nearly half an hour to walk, and that's why I use the car. I use it as another pair of legs. Frustration, which is of course also a part of an evocative or sentiment. Another one saying, how can you imagine living in a place where you feel alienated from the mainstream of life? There are many of us who do not want to be maintained. We want to belong to society. We want to be just like everyone else. I'm longing to walk to the corner cafe, shop, to have a sound of children playing, dogs barking. I want to eat in the corner cafe, see young people in love, walk on to the library, catch the BART, the bus rapid train transit in San Francisco. So again, this idea of feeling as a burden, feeling on the edge of society, and do not just want to have bare minimum of maintaining, but actually being equal as a citizen. The final quote I just took with me here is another respondent saying, well, the sidewalk here are deteriorated and very uneven. The cracks make it difficult for me to walk. See, I'm walking on this part of the sidewalk to avoid the big crack. Since I use a little shopping cart as my walker, my cart will get stuck in the crack, on the crack. I have to go around it. I have to be always looking down and find a path that it even so that my cart doesn't get stuck. And I think we could find many other examples. And in my book, I've also tried to bring in. But I wanted just to bring some voices from those people that I'm talking about in this presentation. And so let me try to say a few things about what I think this means. And this is mainly more touching upon the ongoing research that I'm doing right now and the sort of writing up of a follow-up book to the mobility and justice by design, where I start thinking about design's role in society. And one of the things that I realized was that there was actually an old Ronald Latour quote that probably was sitting somewhere in the back of my mind. Latour says in this quote, architects and planners and designers and clients and users are more open to the idea that a building is negotiated and thus can be modified. So the artifactuality of a building is then more visible. I think it's also a simple result of living in a city. We begin to be more attuned, more aware of things that are made. And this could be also unmade. The feeling of artifactuality and the constructivity of it is maybe more salient. So I think if it's made, it can be remade or even unmade. And I think that's one of the powerful things that we have to recognize about design. I've been fairly critical about it up till now in this presentation, but also I would allow for an open space for us to think about the transformative capacities of design and the fact that we are in this world that is artifactual, it's made. And if it's made, then what does it take to unmake it or remake it? And I think these are some powerful and important questions. They lash on to different parts of the theoretical work done. I'm particularly interested in the work of Arturo Escobar when he talks about design for the pluriverse. And in it, he talks about many different interesting things, but he says we rarely think of these days about the ways in which our lives are thoroughly designed. It's a sedimented and thus invisible history, yet no less effective because of that. So this idea that we have to understand how much design actually means for the role of our well-being, but also of the ontology of what it means to be a human being. Something that prevents me from this wayfinding something. Sure. Okay, yeah. So as Latour argued, even if some architects see themselves as God, none would be foolish enough to believe that they can create ex nihilo. On the contrary, architects' stories of their own achievements are full of little words to explain how they are led to a solution, constrained by other buildings, limited by other interests, guided by the inner logics of the material, forced to obey the necessity of place, influenced by the choice of their colleagues, held up by the state of the art, and so on. If we become attentive to the humbler ways of speaking, this agency shift from the all-powerful master to the many things, agents, and actants with which we have to share our action. I think this is where I want to go with the opening up the space of understanding that the made is artificial and it's these things are made by designers, but also that they're always contextually made in relationship to certain constraints, certain things that are not something of the designer's will, but something which is have to be understood in the relationality of what's actually going on. And the big question here is, to return to Escobar, can design be reoriented from its dependence on the marketplace towards creative experimentation with forms, concepts, territories, and materials, especially when appropriated by subaltern communities struggling to redefine their life projects in a mutually enhancing manner with the earth? So I think there's a question to or an agenda to open up around design's transformative potential and how we can connect to this. I already flagged the work of David Gisson, a very interesting critical disability scholar, who argues that I believe disability provides a lens on aesthetic concepts, but it also provides alternatives that re-engage weakness, frailty, and incapacity as affirmative qualities of human beholders and those who create architecture. So the question is whether we can mobilize some of these spaces of design with some of the voices of these people that we normally think of as the vulnerable, or the sort of people with no voice, or the people who are not able to speak up. Yes, I'm running towards the end of my 30 minutes, so I'll try to wrap up some of these ideas to some concluding reflections. One thing I want to say is that when I started about 5 years ago to do the research project on exclusionary design, which was the one with the people in homelessness and the ethnographic work in the city of Copenhagen, very quickly when I started traveling around telling sort of more publicly around the results, people were really interested in that because of the leaning benches and all that stuff. And a lot of people were sort of morally concerned, is that happening in our cities and stuff like that? And a side effect, I had a kind of very clear idea of, this research would take us into a realm where we can show critically what is happening and so forth on the ground. But as I lectured around and talked to publics, I also realized that I was constantly talking into a context of design as a good thing, design as benevolent. And so I realized that, and this is one of the things that I'm really interested in, that there is a cultural resonance of seeing design and architecture as automatically positive. Design is often perceived as innovative, creative, and productivity enhancing. This is giving architecture and design a reputation for being smart. But how should we relate to design and architecture that doesn't mean well? What are the norms and forms of power associated with this less publicized side of architecture and design? So I think we need to walk this balance, recognizing both, potential, but also a problem in these sorts of things. Many years ago, Emin Thrift wrote about the molecular politics. And I think that rather than the big institutional politics, I'm interested in the molecular politics, where bodies are given space for the opposite. The ways in which mobility design cater for certain bodies and dismiss the mobility of others is indeed political. So is the way in which bodies feel, sense, and experience the effects of design world of mobility. How does it feel to be able to cross the road for green light? How does it, or not to be able to cross it? How does it feel to be unable to ride the bus because of lacking ramp facilities to accommodate wheelchairs? How does it feel to be looking for shelter in a city full of leaning benches and metal spikes? In the multiple spaces and systems designed for mobility, we find bodies on the move or prevented from moving. We find bodily moving orchestrated along the stratifying principles and designs. Hence, the molecular politics of mobility and justice has to do with bodies and how they are rendered political, formally or informally. I think we could talk about, with Michelle, how we can engage the kinopolitical. How can we engage the challenging the kinopolitical constellations of uneven mobilities or mobility regimes in ways that might entrain greater mobility justice and enable us to imagine different planetary futures? So, finally, I think we need to realize that design is both part of the solution and part of the problem. We might want to connect to the kinopolitical in the sense that Michelle and Thomas Nail is arguing, but I think we also have to recognize design has a transformative potential that may point toward a new molecular politics. And I think we need a design practice and research to explore design as what I call organized contingency, a systematic and critical creative exploration and understanding of the fact that the world could be different. As the built environment is made, a new politics of design is about exploring the remade or even the unmade. Remaking and unmaking the built environment that produces mobility and justice by design is where design's transformational potential lies. Thank you for your attention.